The year was 1914, and in a small farmhouse in Iowa, a baby boy was born who would one day save more lives than anyone else in history. His name was Norman Borlaug, though at the time, he was just another farm kid born to hardworking parents who hoped their son would have a better life than they did growing up on that small family farm during the early 1900s. Shaped Norman in ways nobody could have predicted. His days started before sunrise, helping his father tend to the fields and care for their animals. The work was hard, the days were long, but young Norman loved being outdoors, his hands in the soil, watching things grow from tiny seeds into plants that would feed his family. But farm life wasn't all sunshine and growth. Norman saw firsthand how quickly things could go wrong. One bad season, one plant disease, one stretch of unusual weather, and suddenly families who worked just as hard as his own didn't have enough to eat. During the tough times of the Great Depression, he watched neighbors lose their farms, their livelihoods, their hope. These early experiences burned something important into his mind. Food wasn't just food. It was security. It was peace. It was life itself. Norman was bright, brighter than most kids in his one-room schoolhouse. His grandfather, who lived with the family, often told him, "You're too smart to be a farmer, Norman. You need to go get yourself an education." Those words stuck with him, though at first he wasn't sure what to do with them. College wasn't something farm kids from his area typically considered, but Norman wasn't typical. After finishing high school, where he excelled despite often missing classes during busy farming seasons, he set his sights on college. With barely enough money for the bus fare, he headed to the University of Minnesota in 1933. It was the depth of the Great Depression, and Norman had to work odd jobs just to pay for his meals and a place to sleep. He started studying forestry, thinking he'd work with trees and still be connected to the land. But then something unexpected happened, a moment that would change the direction of his life and eventually the world. Norman took a class with a professor named Elvin Stackman, who taught plant pathology, the study of diseases that affect plants. Stackman wasn't like other professors. He didn't just teach facts. He inspired his students to think bigger. He talked about hunger, about how plant diseases could wipe out entire food supplies, about how science could help feed people. For Norman, who had seen hunger up close, these weren't abstract ideas. They were real problems affecting real people. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. Stackman would quote from Henry David Thoreau, "If you want to solve hunger, you need to strike at its roots." Norman decided then and there he would be that one person striking at the root. He switched his major to plant pathology and threw himself into his studies with a determination that surprised even his professors. While other students memorized enough to pass their exams, Norman wanted to understand everything. Not just what was happening to plants when disease struck, but why it happened and, most importantly, how to stop it. Graduate school followed, and Norman dug even deeper into his studies. He wasn't just interested in academic knowledge. He wanted practical solutions. He spent as much time in experimental fields as he did in classrooms and laboratories, getting his hands dirty, testing theories against reality. But then world events intervened. World War II erupted, and Norman, like many young men of his generation, joined the military. His scientific background led him to a special assignment working on medical research for the U.S. Navy. He helped develop ways to control the spread of malaria and other diseases among troops in the South Pacific. It wasn't the plant work he'd trained for, but it taught him something invaluable: how to tackle big problems with limited resources and difficult conditions. When the war ended in 1945, Norman faced a choice. He could take a comfortable position at a university or in a government agricultural department. The pay would be good, the work respectable. Many of his colleagues chose that path. But Norman was drawn to a different opportunity, one that most scientists thought was career suicide. The Rockefeller Foundation, working with the Mexican government, was looking for scientists to help Mexico increase its food production. The country was struggling to feed its growing population. Wheat, a staple crop, was being devastated by stem rust disease, a fungus that could destroy entire fields in weeks. Previous scientists had tried to solve the problem and given up. The working conditions were primitive compared to American research facilities. The pay was less. The challenge seemed impossible. That's exactly why Norman wanted it. His wife, Margaret, was understandably concerned. They had a young daughter and another child on the way. Moving to a foreign country with limited medical facilities and an uncertain future wasn't the safe choice. But Margaret knew her husband. She'd watched him work himself to exhaustion as a student, driven by the belief that his work could matter. "If this is what you feel called to do," she told him, "then we'll make it work." In 1944, the Borlaug family arrived in Mexico. The reality was even harsher than Norman had expected. The research station was little more than a few sheds. Local farmers were skeptical of this American who didn't even speak their language, but claimed he could help them. His scientific colleagues back home warned him he was wasting his time and talent. "The problems are too complex," one former professor wrote to him. "The growing conditions too varied. The politics too complicated. Come back to the States where you can actually make progress." But Norman saw something others didn't. In those struggling wheat fields, he didn't just see a scientific challenge, he saw hungry children. He saw farmers working from sunrise to sunset only to watch their crops wither and die. He saw a problem everyone believed was unsolvable, and something in him, perhaps that farm boy from Iowa, who'd watched neighbors lose everything, refused to accept that any problem affecting so many lives could truly be impossible to solve. At night, after long days in the experimental fields, Norman would sit at a small desk in their modest home, poring over books and research papers by lamplight. He'd make notes, draw diagrams, and try to piece together what others had missed. His wife would bring him coffee, touching his shoulder gently, sometimes reminding him to sleep. "I'm close to something," he'd tell her. "I can feel it." What he was close to was a completely new way of thinking about the problem. Previous scientists had tried to create wheat varieties that could resist disease in Mexican growing conditions. But Mexican growing conditions weren't just one thing. They varied enormously by region, elevation, and season. Norman began to wonder, what if, instead of creating one perfect wheat variety, they needed to create wheat that could adapt to many different conditions? What if the solution wasn't a single answer but a new approach to finding answers? It was this kind of thinking that set Norman apart. Where others saw limitations, he saw possibilities. Where others stuck to established methods, he was willing to try the untested. Where others worked within the system, he was ready to create entirely new systems if that's what the problem required. As the first year in Mexico ended, Norman had more questions than answers. The experimental crops had mostly failed. The local farmers remained skeptical. His superiors at the foundation were getting impatient for results, but Norman Borlaug was just getting started. His mind was already forming a revolutionary idea, one that would eventually change farming forever and save countless lives. An idea that would lead him from those struggling Mexican fields to the far corners of the earth, and eventually, to a stage in Oslo where he would receive humanity's highest recognition. That farm boy from Iowa, who understood in his bones what it meant when crops failed, was about to embark on the most important work of his life, and the world, though it didn't know it yet, was about to change forever. The Mexican sun beat down mercilessly on Norman Borlaug's back as he walked through fields of dying wheat. It was 1945, and he had been in Mexico for nearly a year with little to show for it. The situation was worse than anyone had told him. Wheat crops were being destroyed by stem rust, a nasty fungal disease that turned healthy wheat stems into a broken mess of black spores. In bad years, it wiped out 80% or more of the entire Mexican wheat harvest. Local farmers had a saying, "When the rust comes, we eat memories." It meant that when the crops failed, all they could do was remember better times when their families had enough to eat. Norman wiped sweat from his forehead and crouched down to examine another infected plant. The tiny spores could travel hundreds of miles on the wind, infecting field after field. It was like trying to stop the air itself. "Impossible," one of his Mexican assistants said, watching Norman take samples and make notes. "My father tried to fight the rust. My grandfather, too. Always it returns." Norman looked up at him. "Nothing's impossible," he said. "We just haven't found the right approach yet." But privately, in letters home to his wife, who had temporarily returned to the United States with their young children due to health concerns, Norman admitted the challenge was daunting. "The disease is smarter than we are," he wrote. "Just when we think we've beaten it, it changes and attacks again. But I can't go home until I've solved this. Too many people are counting on us." The us was a small team of scientists and local workers that Norman had assembled. Most of the Mexican farmers viewed them with suspicion. Why should they trust this American who didn't even speak their language properly? Previous scientists had come with big promises and left with nothing accomplished. One elderly farmer, after watching Norman work for several days, approached him. "My son says you believe you can beat the rust," he said through an interpreter. Norman nodded. "Yes, I do." The old man gestured to the fields around them. "I have farmed this land for 60 years. My family has farmed it for generations before me. The rust has always won. Always. With respect," Norman replied. "Just because something has always been a certain way doesn't mean it must continue that way." The old farmer studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "We will see," he said, but there was no hope in his voice. This was the reality Norman faced daily, not just the scientific challenge, but the weight of generations of defeat. How do you solve a problem when everyone, even those most affected by it, believes it's unsolvable? Back in his small office, which was really just a converted storage room with a desk, Norman spread out his notes and research papers. The traditional approach to fighting plant disease was to find a naturally resistant variety and breed it with locally adapted varieties. But the stem rust kept mutating, overcoming resistance almost as quickly as new varieties could be developed. His colleagues back in the United States suggested he was wasting his time. One former professor wrote, "Norman, be realistic. Some problems don't have solutions. Come back to Minnesota where you can work on more promising research." But Norman couldn't accept that. Not just because of his stubborn nature, though he had plenty of that. It was because he had seen the human cost of the problem. He'd visited villages where children had distended bellies from malnutrition. He'd watched farmers weep over fields destroyed just weeks before harvest. This wasn't just a scientific puzzle, it was a matter of life and death. One evening, as Norman was walking back to his quarters after another long, frustrating day, he passed a group of children playing soccer with a makeshift ball in the dust. They were laughing despite their obvious poverty, despite the fact that some of them would go to bed hungry that night. One boy kicked the ball toward Norman, inviting him to join their game. Norman played with them for a few minutes, his scientific worries momentarily forgotten. When it was time to leave, the boy who had invited him asked, "Will you come back tomorrow?" "I'll try," Norman said, smiling. "We'll be here," the boy replied. "We're always here." Something about those simple words, "we're always here," struck Norman deeply. These children, these families, these communities, they didn't have the option to give up and go somewhere else. They couldn't walk away from the problem like his colleagues suggested he should. That night, Norman couldn't sleep. He paced his small room, thinking about everything he knew about wheat, about rust, about plant breeding. There had to be an answer. He just wasn't seeing it yet. The next morning, he called a meeting of his small team. "We need to try something completely different," he announced. "The old methods aren't working." His Mexican colleagues exchanged glances. They were used to Norman's intensity, but there was something different about him today. "What do you propose?" asked Carlos, his chief assistant. Norman began outlining a radical new approach. Instead of trying to find one perfect solution, they would try to develop wheat varieties that could adapt to multiple conditions and resist not just one strain of rust, but many. "It's like trying to hit a moving target," he explained. "So instead of aiming where the target is, we need to create something that can hit it wherever it moves." The team looked skeptical, but they were willing to follow Norman's lead. They had seen his dedication, his refusal to accept defeat. The work that followed was grueling. Norman established test plots in different regions of Mexico, with varying climates and growing conditions. He began crossbreeding hundreds of wheat varieties from around the world, looking for combinations that might create the adaptability and disease resistance they needed. Each new variety had to be planted, tended, observed, tested, and documented. It was painstaking work, and for every small success, there were dozens of failures. The Rockefeller Foundation, which funded the project, began to question the lack of progress. After 2 years with little to show, they sent a supervisor to evaluate whether the program should continue. The supervisor arrived during a particularly difficult period. A recent batch of promising wheat varieties had all succumbed to a new strain of rust. Norman's team was discouraged, and some were talking about quitting. "Perhaps we should reconsider our approach," the supervisor suggested after reviewing the situation. "Maybe focus on more modest goals. Just improving yield slightly would be considered a success." Norman shook his head. "That's not good enough," he said. "Mexico doesn't need slightly better wheat. It needs wheat that can feed its people reliably, year after year. The supervisor sighed. Norman, I admire your dedication, but at some point we have to be practical. The foundation has limited resources, and they want to invest them where they can make a difference. We are making a difference, Norman insisted. We're learning what doesn't work, which brings us closer to what will work. That's scientist talk, the supervisor replied. The board wants results. That evening, Norman took the supervisor to visit one of the villages near their test fields. They were invited into the home of a family whose father worked occasionally as a field hand for the research station. The house was small and simple, just 2 rooms for a family of 6. Dinner was a thin soup with a few vegetables and tortillas. The children ate quietly, obviously still hungry when the small portions were gone. The mother apologized for the modest meal. When my husband can work at your fields, we eat better, she explained. But there isn't always work. There will be, Norman promised her. When we develop better wheat, there will be more work, more food, better prices for everyone. She smiled politely, but Norman could see she didn't really believe him. Why should she? She had heard such promises before. As they walked back to the research station, the supervisor was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "You have 1 more year to show significant progress. After that, we'll need to reassess." Norman nodded, knowing this was the best he could hope for. 1 more year to solve a problem that had defeated generations of farmers and scientists. That night, unable to sleep again, Norman reviewed everything they had tried and everything they had learned. There had to be something they were missing, some approach they hadn't considered. And then around 3 a.m., Norman had an insight. Part of their problem was time. It took a full growing season to test each new wheat variety, meaning they could only run 1 set of experiments per year. What if they could run 2? Mexico had different growing regions with opposite seasons. In the lowlands, wheat grew during the winter. In the highlands, it grew during the summer. What if they planted their test crops in both regions, effectively doubling their research speed? This approach, which Norman would later call shuttle breeding, was considered impossible by conventional wisdom. Plants adapted to specific growing conditions. Trying to breed varieties that could grow in 2 dramatically different environments seemed like a recipe for failure. But Norman was desperate enough to try the impossible. The next morning, he explained his idea to the team. Some thought he had finally lost his mind from overwork. Others were willing to try anything at this point. They began preparing test plots in both the highlands and lowlands, planning to shuttle the most promising seeds back and forth between the 2 regions. What happened next would change the course of agricultural history, though no one realized it at the time. By growing 2 generations of wheat each year instead of 1, they accelerated their breeding program dramatically. But something even more important happened, something Norman hadn't anticipated. The wheat varieties that survived both environments, the hot, humid lowlands and the cool, dry highlands, were hardier than anyone expected. They seemed to develop a kind of adaptability that made them not just resistant to existing strains of rust, but more capable of fighting off new strains as, well, it was like they had accidentally created wheat with a stronger immune system. By the end of that crucial 3rd year, Norman's team had developed several wheat varieties that showed real promise. The supervisor returned, expecting to shut down the program, and was shocked to find fields of healthy wheat where rust-infected plants had stood the year before. "How?" he asked simply. Norman explained their shuttle breeding technique and showed the data they had collected. The new wheat varieties weren't just resisting rust. They were producing better yields than traditional Mexican wheat even in good years. The supervisor was impressed enough to extend the program, but cautioned Norman not to get too excited yet. "Let's see if these results hold up over time," he said. They did more than hold up. Over the next few years, Norman's team refined their techniques and developed even better wheat varieties. By the early 1950s, Mexican farmers who had been skeptical of the American scientist with big ideas were clamoring for his wheat seeds. That elderly farmer, who had doubted Norman years earlier, came to visit the research station. He held some of the new wheat seeds in his weathered palm, studying them carefully. "These will really grow without the rust taking them?" he asked. "They have so far," Norman replied. "Nothing is guaranteed forever, but these are the strongest varieties we've ever seen." The old man nodded slowly. "Then my grandchildren will not have to eat memories," he said. It was perhaps the greatest compliment Norman Borlaug ever received. By 1956, Norman Borlaug stood in a Mexican wheat field, watching farmers harvest a crop that would have been impossible just a decade earlier. Where rust-infected plants once wilted and died, strong stalks of wheat now stood tall, heavy with grain. Mexico, which had imported more than half its wheat when Norman arrived, was now growing enough to feed its own people. It should have been a moment of pure triumph. But Norman wasn't celebrating yet. "We've won a battle," he told his team as they watched the harvest, but not the war. The wheat varieties they had developed through shuttle breeding were indeed resistant to rust and produced good yields. But Norman had noticed a problem. When too much fertilizer was applied or when the wheat got too much rain, the plants grew too tall and fell over before harvest, a condition called lodging. All that potential food would rot on the ground, just when farmers thought they were on the verge of their best harvest ever. Most scientists would have been content with what they'd already accomplished. Norman had solved the rust problem that everyone said was unsolvable. He could have written his research papers, collected professional accolades, and moved on to a comfortable university position. But that wasn't who Norman Borlaug was. He couldn't stop thinking about those fallen wheat stalks and the hungry people who would miss out on that food. Back in his office, which was now a proper research facility rather than a converted storage room, Norman spread out photographs of different wheat varieties from around the world. He was looking for something specific: wheat plants with naturally shorter, stronger stalks that wouldn't fall over when heavy with grain. One of his assistants, a young Mexican agronomist named Eduardo, watched him curiously. "What exactly are we looking for?" "I'm not sure yet," Norman admitted, "but I'll know it when I see it." Days turned into weeks as Norman corresponded with research stations worldwide, requesting samples and information. His wife Margaret, who had moved back to Mexico with their children after the program became established, would find him asleep at his desk some mornings, surrounded by papers and plant specimens. "You need to rest properly," she told him one morning, bringing him coffee. Norman rubbed his tired eyes. "I'll rest when we've solved this," he said. "There's something out there, some wheat variety that has what we need. I just have to find it." His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A Japanese scientist named Orville Vogel had been working with a dwarf variety of wheat from Japan called Norin 10. This wheat had exactly what Norman was looking for: short, strong stalks that wouldn't lodge even with heavy grain and plenty of fertilizer. When Norman received the Norin 10 samples, he knew immediately this could be the answer, but there was a problem. The Japanese wheat wasn't adapted to Mexican growing conditions and lacked the disease resistance they'd worked so hard to develop. "So we start over," Norman told his team. "We cross our rust-resistant varieties with this dwarf wheat and see what happens." His team looked at him in disbelief. They had spent years developing the current wheat varieties. "Starting over seemed like madness, trust me," Norman said, seeing their expressions. "This is how we take what we've done from good to great." The work that followed was even more grueling than their earlier efforts. The Japanese dwarf gene didn't combine easily with their Mexican wheat varieties. Each cross required careful hand pollination, a painstaking process where pollen from one plant is manually transferred to another. During peak breeding seasons, Norman and his team worked from sunrise to sunset 7 days a week. They would pollinate plants in the morning, record data in the afternoon, and plan the next day's work in the evening. One night, after a particularly exhausting day, Eduardo found Norman still in the fields with a flashlight, examining plants. "Dr. Borlaug," he said, "you need to rest." "We all do." Norman looked up, seeming surprised to find it was dark. "Do you know how many people die of hunger each day in the world?" he asked quietly. Eduardo shook his head. "Thousands," Norman said. "Mostly children. While we're sleeping tonight, children will die because there wasn't enough food. So forgive me if I'm not very interested in rest right now." Eduardo was silent for a moment. Then he took out his own small flashlight. "Which section were you checking?" he asked. Together they worked for another 2 hours before finally calling it a night. This relentless pace took its toll. Norman rarely saw his family despite living in the same small community. His children sometimes joked they only saw their father at dinner, and not always then. His health suffered. He lost weight, developed chronic back pain from bending over wheat plants, and battled frequent colds from working in all weather conditions. But the work progressed. By combining their rust-resistant wheat with the Japanese dwarf varieties, they slowly developed new types of wheat that had the best qualities of both. These new varieties were short enough to remain standing even when heavy with grain, and fertilized to maximum productivity, yet still resistant to the rust that had plagued Mexican wheat for generations. There were countless failures along the way. Entire generations of crossbred wheat would show promise only to fail in field tests. Sometimes the plants were resistant to old strains of rust but vulnerable to new ones. Sometimes they stayed short but produced less grain. Finding the perfect combination seemed impossible. But Norman Borlaug had a remarkable ability to learn from failure. Each unsuccessful cross taught him something new about what worked and what didn't. He kept meticulous records, analyzing patterns that others might have missed. Failure isn't the opposite of success, he often told discouraged team members. It's part of success. By the early 1960s, their persistence paid off. The new semi-dwarf wheat varieties they developed were nothing short of revolutionary. They stayed short even with heavy fertilization, resisted multiple strains of rust, adapted to various growing conditions, and, most importantly, produced up to 3 times more grain than traditional varieties. When the first test fields of these new wheat types were harvested, the results were so impressive that local farmers thought there must be some trick involved. They couldn't believe wheat could produce so much grain per acre. An official from the Mexican Agriculture Department came to inspect the fields, suspecting exaggerated reports. He walked through the test plots with Norman, measuring yields and examining the wheat. "This changes everything," he said finally. "Not just for Mexico, but potentially for the world." Norman nodded. He had already been thinking beyond Mexico. The same problems they had solved here: plant diseases, poor yields. Wheat that couldn't handle fertilizer were affecting countries around the world, particularly in developing regions where hunger was a constant threat. "How quickly can we scale up production of these seeds?" the official asked. "Not quickly enough," Norman replied, "but we'll do our best." The Mexican government threw its support behind Norman's work, establishing seed production facilities and distribution networks to get the new wheat varieties to farmers across the country. Within a few years, Mexico went from importing wheat to being a wheat exporter, an agricultural transformation that many had thought impossible. But for Norman, this success, remarkable as it was, only highlighted how much more needed to be done. He began receiving letters from agricultural officials and scientists in other countries, all asking the same question. Would these miracle wheat varieties work in their regions too? Norman wanted to find out. Despite resistance from some administrators who thought he should focus on Mexican agriculture, he began sending seed samples to research stations in other Latin American countries. The results came back positive. The wheat that had transformed Mexican farming was working elsewhere too. Then came a request that would change the course of Norman's life and work. In the mid-1960s, India and Pakistan, both struggling with rapidly growing populations and inadequate food supplies, reached out to the Rockefeller Foundation. They had heard about the Mexican wheat miracle and wanted Norman Borlaug's help. The situation in South Asia was dire. Both countries faced imminent food shortages that could lead to mass starvation. Millions of lives were potentially at stake. But there were enormous obstacles to implementing Norman's agricultural innovations there. First, there was the scale of the challenge. Mexico had about 40 million people at that time. India had over 400 million. The farming regions of the subcontinent dwarfed those of Mexico. Second, there were political complications. India and Pakistan had been formed after the partition of British India in 1947, and relations between the two nations were hostile. They had already fought one war and would soon fight another, yet both needed Norman's help, and he would need to work in both countries. Third, there were the entrenched agricultural bureaucracies in both countries, which viewed this American scientist and his revolutionary ideas with suspicion. Many local officials and scientists were openly skeptical that wheat varieties developed in Mexico could work in the completely different growing conditions of South Asia. When Norman received the requests for help, he called a meeting with his core team in Mexico. "They're asking me to go to India and Pakistan," he told them. "The situation there is even worse than what we faced here when we started. They need our wheat, our techniques, our experience. But our work here isn't finished," Eduardo pointed out. "We're still refining the varieties, still improving yields." "You're right," Norman agreed. That's why I'm not asking all of you to go. Most of you should stay here and continue what we've built. But I have to go. This is why we did all this work. Not just to feed Mexico, but to help feed the world. His team understood. They had worked alongside Norman long enough to know that for him, this had never been just a scientific challenge or a career advancement. It had always been about feeding hungry people, as many as possible. Norman spent weeks preparing for the trip, gathering seeds, data, equipment, and materials. His wife Margaret helped him pack, knowing this would mean another long separation from their family. "How long do you think you'll be gone?" she asked. Norman shook his head. "I don't know. These things take time. But this is important, Margaret. Really important," she smiled and touched his cheek. "I know. That's why I've never tried to stop you." As his departure date approached, Norman received a disturbing report from advance teams in India and Pakistan. The bureaucratic resistance was even worse than expected. Some officials were actively working to block his program before it even started, seeing it as an American intrusion into their affairs. "Maybe I should reconsider," Norman told Margaret. "If they don't want our help." "Since when has a little resistance stopped you?" she asked. "Didn't you tell me once that the rust disease was smarter than you were, but you beat it anyway?" "I think you can handle a few stubborn bureaucrats." Norman laughed. "You always know what to say." "That's why you married me," she replied. "Now go pack your bags. There are people waiting for you to help them, whether they know it yet or not." And so in 1963, carrying boxes of special seed wheat and a determination that had already transformed one nation's agriculture, Norman Borlaug set off for the other side of the world. A world that had no idea it was about to change forever. When Norman Borlaug stepped off the plane in New Delhi in March 1963, the air was thick with tension. News headlines warned of impending famine. Government officials spoke in hushed tones about how many months of food reserves remained. The math was simple and terrifying. India's population was growing faster than its food supply. Pakistan faced the same grim equation. Norman's first meeting with Indian agricultural officials did not go well. He sat in a stuffy conference room as a senior bureaucrat explained why Norman's wheat varieties, so successful in Mexico, would surely fail in India. "Our conditions are nothing like Mexico," the official said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "Our soils, our climate, our farming methods, all different. Your wheat won't grow here." Several other officials nodded in agreement. Norman noticed that none of them were farmers or plant scientists. They were administrators who had spent their careers shuffling papers in government offices. "With respect," Norman replied, keeping his voice level despite his frustration. "I'd like to test that assumption. Let's plant some test plots and see what happens." "We have our own wheat breeding programs," another official said dismissively. "We don't need American scientists telling us how to grow our staple crop." Norman took a deep breath. He hadn't come halfway around the world to be stopped by pride and politics. "India's wheat yield averages about 800 pounds per acre," he said. "In Mexico, we're now averaging over 2,400 pounds per acre with our new varieties. I'm not here to take over your programs. I'm here to share what we've learned so you can adapt it to your needs." The room fell silent. The numbers were hard to argue with. Finally, a younger official spoke up. "Perhaps we could set up some small demonstration plots, just to see if there's anything to learn." Norman could work with that. It wasn't the large-scale implementation he had hoped for, but it was a start. What followed was a year of small victories and large setbacks. Norman traveled constantly between India and Pakistan, navigating not only different agricultural systems, but also the political minefield of working in two nations hostile to each other. In Pakistan, he found a more receptive audience initially, but equally difficult field conditions. During his first visit to a wheat research station near Lahore, he found outdated equipment, demoralized scientists, and wheat fields ravaged by rust disease. Exactly the problem he had solved in Mexico. The head of the station, Dr. Malik, showed him their current wheat varieties, all tall plants susceptible to lodging when fertilized. "We know about your semi-dwarf varieties," Dr. Malik said, "but many here believe they won't stand up to our hot winds and variable rainfall." Norman had heard these doubts before. "Let's find out," he said simply. They planted test plots with Norman's semi-dwarf wheat alongside traditional Pakistani varieties. Similar test plots were being planted across the border in India. Now came the hardest part for a man of action like Norman Borlaug, waiting. While the wheat grew, Norman didn't. He traveled to rural villages, meeting with farmers, learning about local conditions, and preparing for the work ahead if the test plots succeeded. What he saw troubled him deeply. In a small village outside Karachi, Norman sat with a family whose youngest child was clearly malnourished. The mother explained that they had been rationing food for months. The father, a wheat farmer, had lost most of his crop to stem rust the previous season. "We feed the youngest children first," she said. "Then the older ones if there is enough. My husband and I eat last." Norman looked at the thin faces of the children and thought of his own children back home, never knowing true hunger. He recommitted himself to pushing through whatever obstacles stood in his way. Back in New Delhi, Norman faced his biggest challenge yet. A powerful Indian official was actively blocking the import of fertilizer needed for the test plots. Without adequate fertilizer, the new wheat varieties couldn't demonstrate their true potential. He says India should be self-sufficient in fertilizer production, a junior official explained apologetically. Importing it goes against national policy. But you don't have enough domestic production, Norman pointed out. And without fertilizer, we can't show what these wheat varieties can do. The official shrugged helplessly. His decision is final. Norman was not a man who accepted final decisions when lives were at stake. He arranged a meeting with the Minister of Agriculture, bringing along photos and data from Mexico. Mexico doubled its wheat production in 4 years, Norman told the minister, then doubled it again. Now they export wheat instead of importing it, but it only happened because they used the complete package, the right seeds with the right amount of fertilizer. The minister studied the photos showing the dramatic difference between fertilized and unfertilized fields of the same wheat variety. "And you believe we could see similar results here?" "I believe you could see better results," Norman said. "India has more arable land, more farmers, and more at stake." The minister was silent for a long moment. "I'll authorize a one-time fertilizer import," he said finally. "Enough for your demonstration plots. After that, we'll see." It was another small victory in a campaign that needed many. As the test wheat grew, word spread among local farmers. They would gather at the edges of the demonstration plots, watching with interest as Norman's wheat grew differently than what they were used to. The plants were shorter, with thicker stems that didn't bend under the weight of developing grain heads. An older farmer approached Norman during one of his field visits. "They say this is miracle wheat," he said through an interpreter. Norman shook his head. "Not miracles," he replied. "Just science and hard work." The farmer gestured toward the field. "If it grows like this on my land, I will call it a miracle." When harvest time came in spring 1964, the results were exactly what Norman had hoped for. In both India and Pakistan, his semi-dwarf wheat varieties significantly outperformed local varieties, in many cases producing twice the yield per acre. Dr. Malik in Pakistan was among the first to acknowledge the success. "I didn't believe it was possible," he told Norman as they stood in a field of harvested wheat. "None of us did. It's just the beginning," Norman replied. "If we can implement this on a large scale, with proper fertilizer and irrigation, the yields could go even higher." Government officials were harder to convince. They acknowledged the success of the demonstration plots but raised new concerns about large-scale implementation. "Where will we get enough seed?" asked an Indian official. "How will we train thousands of farmers in these new methods?" asked another. "What if the weather next year isn't as favorable?" worried a third. Norman had anticipated these questions. He laid out a detailed plan for seed multiplication, farmer training programs, and irrigation improvements. "We don't have to convert the entire country at once," he explained. "We start in the regions best suited for these varieties and expand from there." Some officials remained skeptical, but others were becoming believers. The Minister of Agriculture, who had approved the fertilizer import, was now one of Norman's strongest allies. "We need to move quickly," Norman urged. "Every season we delay means more hunger." But bureaucracies rarely move quickly, especially when making major changes to something as fundamental as a nation's food production system. More studies were ordered. More committees were formed. More reports were written. Meanwhile, the population continued to grow and food reserves continued to shrink. In late 1964, Norman received devastating news. Weather forecasts predicted a severe drought for the upcoming growing season across much of South Asia. If accurate, even the current agricultural system would produce far less food than normal, potentially triggering the famine that everyone feared. Norman called an emergency meeting with agricultural officials from both India and Pakistan. It was unprecedented for these hostile neighbors to have representatives in the same room, but the threat transcended politics. "We don't have time for more studies," Norman told them bluntly. "We need to import thousands of tons of seed wheat from Mexico immediately and distribute it to farmers before planting season." "Impossible," said a Pakistani official. "The cost alone, what's the cost of millions of deaths from starvation?" Norman interrupted. "Because that's what we're facing if we don't act now." The room fell silent. The stark reality of the situation was finally sinking in. Within days, both governments approved emergency measures. Planes loaded with Mexico's miracle wheat seeds began flying to South Asia. Training programs were hastily established to teach farmers the new techniques required. Fertilizer imports were authorized. Norman worked around the clock, coordinating shipments, training agricultural extension workers, and troubleshooting problems as they arose. He slept little, ate poorly, and drove himself to the edge of collapse. A colleague found him asleep at his desk one morning, still holding a shipping manifest. "Norman, you need to rest," he said, shaking him gently awake. "Later," Norman mumbled, reaching for his coffee. "You won't do anyone any good if you kill yourself from exhaustion." Norman looked up with bloodshot eyes. "Do you know what's at stake here? The experts are predicting 10 to 20 million deaths from famine if this crop fails. I'll rest when we've prevented that." The 1965-66 growing season became the most critical test of Norman Borlaug's life work. His wheat varieties were now planted across millions of acres in both India and Pakistan. Traditional farming methods were being replaced with new techniques on a massive scale. And just as Norman had feared, the drought arrived with a vengeance. Week after week, the sun beat down on South Asia with barely a drop of rain. Rivers and irrigation canals ran low. Traditional wheat varieties withered in the fields. But something remarkable happened with Norman's wheat. Because the plants directed more energy to the grain and less to growing tall stalks, they needed less water to produce a harvest. They weren't immune to the drought, but they were surviving far better than traditional varieties. Reports began coming in from rural areas. The new wheat was holding up. Not thriving, certainly, but producing enough grain to justify the effort and resources invested. Norman traveled constantly during this period, visiting as many farming regions as possible, making adjustments to irrigation practices, solving problems, encouraging farmers. The strain was showing on him physically. He had lost weight, his clothes hanging loose on his frame, deep lines etched in his face. In a remote village in Punjab, a region that spans the India-Pakistan border, Norman met a farmer who had planted half his land with the new wheat and half with traditional varieties. The farmer led Norman through his fields, showing how the traditional wheat had almost completely failed while the new wheat, though stressed, was still developing grain heads. "My neighbors called me a fool for trying foreign wheat," the farmer said. "Now they ask me for seeds for next season. Will you have enough harvest to share?" Norman asked. The farmer nodded. "Enough to feed my family and have seeds for my neighbors too. Without your wheat, we would all go hungry this year." Multiply this scene by thousands of villages, millions of farmers, and the scale of what was happening became clear. As harvest time approached in spring 1966, even the skeptics had to acknowledge that Norman's wheat had prevented a disaster. The drought had reduced yields, but not nearly as much as would have happened with traditional wheat varieties. When the final harvest numbers came in, they were stunning. Despite the drought, Pakistan had harvested a record wheat crop. India's harvest, while not a record, was far better than anyone had predicted given the weather conditions. The feared famine had been averted. Millions of lives had been saved. Norman should have been elated, but he was too exhausted to celebrate. He had given everything, his time, his health, his energy, to this cause. When the immediate crisis passed, his body finally rebelled. He collapsed with pneumonia and had to be hospitalized. From his hospital bed, Norman received visitors, government ministers, agricultural scientists, farmers who had traveled days just to thank him personally. A journalist came to interview him about what was already being called the Green Revolution in agriculture. "Are you proud of what you've accomplished?" the journalist asked. Norman thought for a moment. Proud isn't the right word, he said finally. Grateful might be better. Grateful that the science worked. Grateful that enough people were willing to take a chance on new ideas. Grateful that we had just enough time before disaster struck. Some people are calling you a hero, the journalist noted. Norman shook his head weakly. The real heroes are the farmers who were willing to try something new when their family's survival depended on the harvest. And we're not done yet. Not nearly. Indeed, they weren't. The 1966 harvest had prevented immediate famine, but population growth continued. More food would be needed each year just to maintain the status quo. Permanent changes to agricultural systems would be required, but now Norman had something powerful on his side. Success. Farmers who had seen the new wheat outperform traditional varieties became eager adopters and advocates. Government officials who had once blocked progress now cleared bureaucratic obstacles. Funding flowed more freely as the economic benefits became clear. By 1968, both India and Pakistan had dramatically expanded their use of the new wheat varieties and modern farming techniques. Regional agricultural research centers were established to continue adapting and improving the wheat for local conditions. Norman's work expanded beyond wheat to include rice, maize, and other staple crops. The Green Revolution was transforming agriculture across Asia and beginning to spread to other parts of the developing world. In a village near where he had first arrived in India 5 years earlier, Norman met with farmers who were harvesting their third crop of the new wheat varieties. Their children looked healthier, their homes more prosperous. One farmer invited Norman for tea after a day in the fields. As they sat in the shade, the farmer's young daughter brought them cups of hot chai. "Before your wheat came," the farmer said quietly, "my oldest son died of hunger. He was 7 years old. I did not have enough food to keep him alive." Norman put down his cup, the familiar ache in his chest whenever he heard such stories. "My younger children," the farmer continued, gesturing to the little girl who had served them, "they will not know hunger as he did. For this I thank you." Norman nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. This was why he had pushed himself beyond exhaustion, why he had battled bureaucrats and skeptics, why he had spent years away from his own family, not for acclaim or awards, but for moments like this, when a father could look at his children and know they would not starve. On an autumn morning in 1970, Norman Borlaug was working in a wheat field outside Mexico City when a man in a suit approached him. Norman, now in his mid-50s but still insisting on doing field work alongside younger colleagues, straightened his aching back and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Dr. Borlaug?" the man called out, looking somewhat out of place in his formal attire. Norman nodded, wondering if this was yet another government official or journalist. He'd been getting more attention lately, though he generally preferred the company of farmers and scientists to politicians and reporters. "I've been trying to reach you for days," the man said, slightly out of breath from walking through the field. "There's an urgent call for you from the Norwegian embassy." Norman frowned. "Norway? I don't know anyone in Norway." "Are you sure they want me?" "Very sure, sir. They said it's extremely important." Norman reluctantly followed the man to the research station's office where a call was waiting. Minutes later, he emerged, looking stunned. His colleague Eduardo looked up from his microscope. "What is it? Bad news?" Norman rarely found himself at a loss for words. "They're giving me the Nobel Peace Prize." Eduardo's mouth fell open. "The Nobel Peace Prize? But that's for diplomats and peacemakers, not scientists."